Eleanor Hastings had been watching him for 3 weeks now, every night from her corner office on the 30th floor. The janitor, Garrett Sullivan, always arrived at 11, pushing his cleaning cart down the empty corridors with the same quiet rhythm, the same careful steps. But it wasn't the cleaning that made her lean closer to the security monitor, her coffee growing cold in her hand. It was what he did after. Every single night at exactly 11:45, he would disappear into the archives room on the 15th floor, a place no janitor had any reason to be. And he'd carry that black duffel bag with him, the one he guarded like it held something far more valuable than mop heads and disinfectant. She'd watched him glance over his shoulder before slipping inside. Watched the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the door. Last night, she saw him hide the bag behind the filing cabinet, tucking it into shadows where the cameras couldn't quite reach. Eleanor told herself she was protecting her company, that this was about security, about the leaked contract that could cost them millions. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the expensive silk blouse and the weight of her title, she knew the truth. She was afraid of what she might find, afraid of what it would mean if she was right, or worse, if she was wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed their lonely song through the empty halls of Hastings Technologies, casting everything in that particular shade of corporate bleakness that only exists after midnight. Eleanor sat in her corner office on the 30th floor. The city sprawled beneath her like a constellation of amber and white, beautiful and utterly indifferent. She'd been CEO for 7 years now, ever since the divorce freed her to pour everything into the company her father had started. The view from up here was supposed to mean something: success, power, arrival. Instead, it mostly meant she worked alone, while everyone else went home to families, to warm dinners, to lives that didn't fit inside office walls. She took a sip of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and grimaced. The security monitor on her desk showed 12 different camera angles, cycling through them every few seconds. Most nights, she barely glanced at them. But 3 weeks ago, she'd noticed something, or rather, someone. Garrett Sullivan, the night janitor, had a routine that didn't quite match his job description. At first, Eleanor told herself she was being paranoid. The leaked contract proposal had everyone on edge. Someone had sent their confidential bid for the Morrison account straight to their biggest competitor, and the deal they'd spent 6 months building had evaporated overnight. The board was calling for blood, demanding answers, threatening investigations. Eleanor needed to find the source of the leak before the whole company fell apart. So she'd started staying later, watching the security feeds, looking for anything unusual, and she'd found Garrett. Every night, same time, same pattern. He'd clean the executive floor, empty the trash bins, vacuum the carpets. Nothing strange there. But then, at 11:45, he'd take his cart down to the 15th floor and disappear into the old archives room. The first time she noticed, she figured maybe he was using the bathroom, taking a break. But it happened every single night. And he always brought that black duffel bag with him, the one he kept separate from his cleaning supplies, the one he touched like it contained something precious or dangerous or both. Tonight, Eleanor watched the monitor with the focus of someone studying evidence. There he was, right on schedule, pushing his cart past the reception desk on 15. She leaned forward, her pulse quickening despite herself. Garrett paused at the archives room door, his head swiveling left and right, checking to make sure he was alone. Even through the grainy security footage, she could see the tension in his shoulders. He pulled out a key. Where had he gotten a key? And slipped inside. The door closed behind him, and Eleanor was left staring at an empty hallway, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. She pulled up the private investigator's report she'd commissioned last week, flipping through pages she'd already memorized. Garrett Sullivan, 38 years old, widowed 2 years ago. His wife Rebecca had died in a car accident on Interstate 90, a rainy night in November, the kind of tragedy that newspapers reduced to 3 paragraphs and a reminder to drive carefully. He had a daughter, Grace, 8 years old, attending public school in the district. Before Hastings Technologies, Garrett had worked as a janitor at Memorial Hospital, and before that, at Lincoln Elementary. His references were solid, his background check clean, his employment record unremarkable. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a single father working the night shift so he could be home when his daughter got off the school bus. But Eleanor had built a $500 million company by trusting her instincts more than paperwork, and her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The PI had tailed Garrett for a week, documenting his movements with photographs and timestamps. Most nights, Garrett went straight home to a modest apartment in the Riverside district, the kind of neighborhood where chain-link fences separated tiny yards and corner stores sold lottery tickets behind bulletproof glass. But twice that week, he'd driven to a coffee shop in the financial district, 20 minutes in the opposite direction, and met with a man in an expensive suit. The PI had captured them in conversation. Garrett sliding a manila envelope across the table, the man in the suit nodding and slipping it into his briefcase. Eleanor stared at that photograph now, her stomach tight. Corporate espionage. It had to be. Someone was paying Garrett to steal information, and he was using his access as a night janitor to go places no one would question. The archives room would be perfect, full of old contracts, employment records, confidential documents that predated the company's digital transition. Eleanor should call security right now, should have him escorted out and arrested. But something held her back. Maybe it was the way Garrett looked in the photographs, tired and worn, in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Maybe it was the image the PI had captured of him picking up his daughter from school. Grace running toward him with a gap-toothed smile while he knelt down to catch her in a hug that looked like the only thing keeping him upright. Eleanor closed the file and rubbed her eyes. She was being soft, letting sentiment cloud her judgment. That was dangerous. The company came first. It always had. But before she made any calls, before she set anything in motion that couldn't be undone, she needed to know for certain what Garrett was doing in that archives room every night. She needed to see what was in that black duffel bag. The decision surprised her with how quickly it formed, how certain it felt. Tomorrow night, she would go down to the 15th floor herself. She would confront Garrett directly, face whatever truth was hiding in those shadows. Eleanor Hastings hadn't built her empire by waiting for other people to solve her problems. If there was a traitor in her company, she would look him in the eye and hear him admit it. And if she was wrong, though she couldn't imagine how she could be wrong, then at least she would know. She glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. Garrett would be finishing up soon, heading home to his daughter, to whatever life he led when he wasn't stealing from her. Eleanor gathered her things and headed for the elevator, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The building felt different at night. All the energy of the day drained away, leaving only the skeleton of what it pretended to be. As she rode down 30 floors, Eleanor caught her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd traded everything warm for everything powerful, and was only just beginning to wonder if the exchange rate had been fair. The next evening, Eleanor arrived at the office at her usual time, but couldn't focus on anything. She went through the motions of her day, conference calls, budget reviews, strategic planning sessions, but her mind kept drifting to 11:45, to the archives room, to Garrett and his secrets. She snapped at her assistant twice and had to apologize, something she rarely did. By the time the sun set and the office emptied, she felt wound so tight she thought she might snap. She ordered dinner she didn't eat and watched the clock tick toward her self-imposed deadline. At 11:30, Eleanor locked her office door and took the stairs down to 15. not wanting the elevator to announce her arrival with its cheerful ding. The stairwell was concrete and echoing, lit by emergency lights that cast everything in harsh white angles. Her breath came faster than the 5 flights warranted, adrenaline making her hands shake slightly as she gripped the railing. This was ridiculous. She was the CEO of a major technology company, not some detective in a crime novel. But she couldn't stop now, couldn't turn back. She had to know. The 15th floor was dark except for the green glow of exit signs and the pale wash of streetlight through the windows. Eleanor made her way to the archives room, her heels abandoned in the stairwell in favor of quiet, stockinged feet. She could hear the distant hum of Garrett's floor buffer somewhere on the other side of the building. A reassuring reminder that she still had time. The archives room door was closed but unlocked, and she slipped inside, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. The room smelled like old paper and dust, rows of filing cabinets stretching into shadows. Eleanor moved quickly to the back corner, where the security camera had shown Garrett hiding his bag. She found it tucked behind the last cabinet, exactly where she'd seen him place it. The duffel bag was heavier than she expected, and her heart hammered as she unzipped it, preparing herself for stolen documents, flash drives full of proprietary information, evidence of betrayal. Instead, she found textbooks, business management, financial accounting, introduction to computer programming, all of them worn and highlighted, pages dog-eared and covered in neat handwritten notes. Underneath the books were notebooks filled with careful calculations, practice problems, essay drafts. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to protect it, a photograph of a woman with dark hair and a bright smile holding a baby. On the back, someone had written in fading ink, "Rebecca and Grace, 2 weeks old. Our whole world." Eleanor stared at the contents of the bag, her certainty crumbling into confusion. She was still kneeling there, trying to make sense of what she was seeing when the lights flicked on. She looked up to find Garrett standing in the doorway, his hand still on the light switch, his face drained of color. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was electric with shock and something else, shame, maybe, on both their parts. "I can explain," Garrett said finally, his voice rough. Eleanor stood up slowly, still holding one of his textbooks. "I think you'd better." He didn't move from the doorway, as if keeping his distance would somehow make this less of a disaster. "How long have you been watching me?" 3 weeks, Eleanor set the book down carefully. "Since the Morrison contract leaked, I thought—" She stopped, hearing how it would sound. "I thought you were stealing from the company." Something flickered across Garrett's face, something that might have been dark humor. "And instead, you found out I'm stealing an education." "Using company resources without permission is still theft, Mr. Sullivan." Eleanor heard herself slip into CEO mode, professional and distant, even though they were standing in a dusty storage room in the middle of the night, surrounded by evidence of desperation rather than crime. "I know." Garrett's shoulders sagged. "I know it's wrong. I couldn't afford the electricity bill to run my laptop at home after Grace goes to bed, and the library closes at 8. I thought, the company's not using this room. The computers down here still work. It wouldn't hurt anyone if I spent a couple hours studying after my shift." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I should have known someone would notice. I should have known better than to think I could get away with trying to be more than what I am." That last sentence hit Eleanor harder than she expected. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since this had started. Garrett Sullivan was tired in a way that went bone deep, the kind of exhaustion that came from working full-time and raising a child alone, and trying to build a future with nothing but hope and stolen hours. His janitor's uniform was clean but worn, his hands rough from chemical cleaners, his eyes holding that particular quality of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment, but kept trying anyway. "Why business management?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with the question. Garrett hesitated, then seemed to decide he had nothing left to lose. "My wife was an engineer. She worked here, actually, 3 years ago. I couldn't understand what she did, what she was working on. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd try to explain, but it was like she was speaking another language. I think she got tired of translating her life for me." He touched the edge of the filing cabinet. "Not quite looking at Eleanor. After she died, I found all these journals she'd kept. Work notes mostly, but personal stuff too. And there was this one entry where she wrote about feeling alone in her marriage because I couldn't meet her where she lived, intellectually. She never said it to me directly, but seeing it written down like that, it broke something in me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She recognized that particular species of loneliness, the kind that existed even in proximity to another person, maybe especially then. "So you're teaching yourself business and programming because your wife wished you understood her work better." "I'm teaching myself because I want Grace to have a father she can be proud of," Garrett corrected quietly. "Because I want to be able to help her with her homework when she gets older. Because I don't want her to grow up thinking her dad is just the guy who empties other people's trash cans." He finally met Eleanor's eyes. "And yeah, because Rebecca deserved better than what I was. I can't fix that now, but I can try to become the person she needed me to be, even if it's too late." The words hung in the dusty air between them. Eleanor thought about her own marriage, how it had dissolved, not because of any dramatic betrayal, but because two people had slowly stopped trying to reach across the distance, had decided their separate ambitions were more important than the difficult work of staying connected. She'd told herself the divorce was about incompatibility, about growing apart, about wanting different things. But standing here, listening to Garrett talk about trying to speak his dead wife's language, Eleanor wondered if she'd given up too easily, if she'd chosen loneliness because it was simpler than vulnerability. "Rebecca was a good engineer," Eleanor said slowly, searching her memory. "I remember her. She worked under Douglas Mercer in the infrastructure division." She paused, piecing together fragments of information. "She left the company rather suddenly, didn't she? I never knew why." Garrett's expression shuddered, something painful moving behind his eyes. "She was fired, or pressured to resign, which amounts to the same thing." "Why?" He was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, each word measured. "She thought Douglas Mercer was embezzling company funds. She found some irregularities in the budget reports, money that didn't quite add up. Transactions that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. So she reported it to HR, followed all the proper channels. But Mercer had been with the company for 15 years, had friends in high places, and Rebecca was just a mid-level engineer who'd been there less than 2. They investigated her claims and found nothing. Said she'd misunderstood the accounting, that everything was legitimate. 2 weeks later, she was let go for performance issues that had never been mentioned before. Eleanor felt ice forming in her stomach. "I didn't know about any of this." "Why would you? You were dealing with the West Coast expansion at the time, barely in the office. And HR kept it quiet. No one wants to advertise that kind of mess." Garrett's jaw tightened. After Rebecca was fired, she couldn't find work anywhere in the industry. Mercer's connections ran deep, and word spread that she was difficult, that she made false accusations, that she had problems with authority. We burned through our savings in 6 months. Rebecca started having panic attacks, stopped sleeping, convinced that we were going to lose everything. The night she died, she'd been coming home from a job interview at a call center. The roads were icy, and his voice cracked. The police said she was going too fast for the conditions. But I think maybe she was just so tired of fighting that she stopped paying attention, stopped caring if she made it home. The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor had to lean against the filing cabinet, her legs suddenly uncertain. She'd built this company alongside her father, had taken over when he retired, had prided herself on running it with integrity and fairness. But she'd also delegated, trusted her executive team, focused on growth and profits and market share, while assuming that HR and her VPs were handling the human details. How many Rebecca Sullivans had there been? How many people had been chewed up by the machine she'd built and then forgotten? "Why did you come to work here?" Eleanor asked. "After everything that happened to Rebecca, why would you apply to Hastings Technologies?" Garrett laughed, and this time there was an edge to it, something sharp and bitter. "You really want to know? Because for 2 years I hated this company. Hated you, if I'm being honest, even though I'd never met you. I blamed Hastings Technologies for Rebecca's death, for destroying her career, for being the thing that broke her. I thought if I could get inside, if I could find proof that Mercer really was stealing, then I could vindicate her, clear her name, make her death mean something." Eleanor's breath caught. "Did you find proof?" "No." The word came out flat, defeated. "I spent 6 months going through every file I could access, every piece of paper in these archives. I hacked into email accounts, read through years of correspondence, looked for any trace of the irregularities Rebecca had reported. And I found nothing. Not because Mercer covered his tracks, but because there was nothing to find. Rebecca was wrong." The admission seemed to cost him something. His shoulders curled inward, his head dropping as if the weight of that truth was physically pressing him down. Eleanor understood, suddenly and completely, what it meant to have your grief invalidated. To lose not just the person you loved, but also the meaning you'd tried to build around their loss. "She wasn't wrong about everything," Eleanor said carefully. "Even if the accounting was legitimate, the way she was treated wasn't. The way the company handled her concerns, the way her career was destroyed, that was real. That mattered." Garrett looked up, something desperate in his eyes. "But don't you see? If she was wrong about Mercer, then she lost everything for nothing. She died believing she'd been right, believing she'd stood up for something important, and it was all just a mistake, a misunderstanding. How do I tell Grace about her mother? How do I explain that the thing that killed her wasn't malice or corruption, just ordinary human error and bureaucratic indifference?" Eleanor didn't have an answer to that. She thought about the leaked Morrison contract, about how quickly she'd jumped to suspicion, about how she'd watched Garrett for weeks through security cameras, building a narrative of betrayal out of nothing more substantial than a man trying to better himself in the margins of his life. She'd been so certain he was the enemy, so ready to believe the worst, that she'd never considered there might be a more complicated truth hiding beneath the surface. "What changed?" she asked. "When did you stop looking for evidence against Mercer and start studying business management instead?" "Grace," Garrett said simply. "One night, about 4 months ago, she asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. She was joking, parroting something she'd heard at school, but it hit me that I didn't have an answer. I'd spent 2 years consumed by anger and grief, and I'd let it turn me into someone I didn't recognize, someone who broke into email accounts and stalked through archives looking for revenge. Rebecca wouldn't have wanted that for me. She wouldn't have wanted Grace to grow up with a father who was hollowed out by bitterness. So I decided to stop trying to prove Rebecca right and start trying to make myself into someone she would have been proud of, someone who could have understood her when she was alive." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some calcified assumption cracking under the weight of recognition. She saw herself in Garrett's confession, the years she'd spent building walls instead of bridges, choosing the certainty of professional success over the vulnerability of human connection. Telling herself it was strength, when maybe it was just fear dressed up in expensive clothes. She thought about her ex-husband, about the quiet resentment that had grown between them like frost, about how she'd blamed him for not understanding the pressures of running a company, when she'd never really tried to understand his world either. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, and meant it in more ways than one. About Rebecca, about what this company did to her, even if it was through negligence rather than malice. "And I'm sorry for spying on you, for assuming the worst, for—" She gestured helplessly at the duffel bag, at the evidence of all her suspicions. "For this." Garrett was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made Eleanor want to look away. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Are you going to fire me?" Eleanor considered the question. By rights, she should. He'd used company property without permission, accessed areas beyond his clearance, violated any number of policies that existed for good reasons. But she thought about the textbooks, filled with careful notes, about the photograph of Rebecca and baby Grace wrapped in plastic to keep it safe, about a man trying to teach himself a new language so he could speak to the ghost of his wife and the future of his daughter. She thought about the kind of company she wanted to run, about the difference between rules and justice, about second chances and the cost of rigidity. "No," she said, "I'm not going to fire you. But we need to make some changes." She pulled out her phone, making a note to herself. "First thing tomorrow. I'm instituting a continuing education program for all employees. Anyone who wants to take classes, business, technology, whatever. The company will cover the cost and provide access to resources. You shouldn't have to sneak around to better yourself, Garrett. No one should." He stared at her as if she'd started speaking in tongues. Why would you do that?" "Because Rebecca was right about something, even if it wasn't what she thought. This company does have a problem, just not the one she identified. We've built a culture where people are afraid to ask for help, where admitting you want to grow feels like revealing weakness, where success is narrowly defined and rigidly enforced. That needs to change." Eleanor felt the idea crystallizing as she spoke, gaining solidity and weight. "And I'm going to go through every termination in the last 5 years with HR, starting with Rebecca's file. If there were others like her, people who were pushed out unfairly, we're going to make it right." Garrett's eyes were bright, and Eleanor realized with some alarm that he was fighting back tears. "That won't bring her back." "No," Eleanor agreed gently. "But it might help Grace know that her mother's struggle mattered, that good things came from it, even if Rebecca never got to see them." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, softer, less fraught with suspicion and defense. Garrett cleared his throat roughly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I should probably go. Grace's babysitter charges extra after 1 in the morning." Eleanor nodded, watching as he carefully packed his books back into the duffel bag, his movements tender, as if he were handling something sacred. At the door, he paused. "Thank you," he said, without turning around. For giving me a chance to explain." After he left, Eleanor stayed in the archives room for a long time, surrounded by the detritus of the company's history, by paper records of decisions and transactions that had seemed important at the time, but now felt distant and small. She thought about the Morrison contract, about how she'd been so focused on finding a traitor that she'd never stopped to examine what kind of environment might breed betrayal in the first place. She thought about her father, about the company he'd built on handshakes and loyalty, about how growth and scale had slowly eroded those human connections until employees became resources, people became problems, and everyone forgot that the point of building something was supposed to be making the world better, not just making money. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Memorial Hospital. Visitor log request." Eleanor had almost forgotten about the other inquiry she'd made, back when she was still convinced Garrett was a corporate spy. She'd asked the PI to check Garrett's previous employment, to see if there was any pattern of suspicious behavior. The attached document was a visitor log from Memorial Hospital, showing when Garrett had clocked in and out during his years working there. Eleanor was about to delete it when something caught her eye. For 6 months, 2 years ago, Garrett's schedule showed him arriving 2 hours early for every shift. The note section explained why. Employee requested permission to sit with patient in ICU before shift. Request approved. Eleanor pulled up Rebecca Sullivan's death certificate, which the PI had also included in his initial background check. She died on November 14th. The visitor log entries showed Garrett arriving early from May through October of that same year. 5 months of arriving early to sit with someone in the ICU, someone who must have lingered for months before finally dying on a rainy highway. Except, Eleanor scrolled through the hospital records again, a cold certainty forming in her gut. Rebecca hadn't died instantly in the car crash. She'd been in a coma. For 5 months, Garrett had worked as a janitor at the same hospital where his wife lay dying, sitting with her for 2 hours before each shift, talking to her, reading to her, hoping she'd wake up. And when she finally died, he'd kept the job for another year because he needed the insurance, needed the stability, needed something to hold on to while he figured out how to be a single father to a daughter who'd just lost her mother. Eleanor sat down hard in one of the ancient desk chairs, her carefully constructed narrative dissolving completely. Garrett Sullivan wasn't a villain or a victim or even particularly a hero. He was just a person trying to survive loss, trying to build meaning out of grief, trying to become someone worthy of the people he'd loved. And Eleanor had watched him through security cameras like he was a specimen to be studied, a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized. She'd forgotten somewhere in the climb to the 30th floor that the view from the top made everything below look small and simple and easy to judge. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid, to be struggling, to be seen. The next morning, Eleanor called an emergency meeting with her executive team and HR. She walked them through what she'd learned, careful to protect Garrett's privacy, while making it clear that the company had failed Rebecca Sullivan and needed to ensure it never happened again. There was resistance, of course. Douglas Mercer protested that the investigation had been thorough, that he'd been cleared of all wrongdoing, that reopening old cases would set a dangerous precedent. But Eleanor had spent the early hours of the morning going through budget reports herself, and while she hadn't found evidence of embezzlement, she'd found something else, a pattern of expense accounts that pushed ethical boundaries, of vendor relationships that benefited Mercer personally, of small corruptions that weren't quite illegal, but weren't quite right either. "You're done," Eleanor told him, her voice carrying the weight of 30 floors of altitude. "Clean out your office by end of day. HR will be in touch about your severance package." The room went silent. No one had seen Eleanor fire a senior executive before, and certainly not one who'd been with the company for nearly 2 decades. But she met each person's eyes in turn, daring them to challenge her, and found no takers. When the meeting ended, she pulled her HR director aside. "I want every termination in the last 5 years reviewed. If we find patterns of unfair treatment, if we find people who were pushed out for speaking up, we make it right. Public acknowledgement, financial compensation, offers to return if they want. This company is going to be a place where doing the right thing doesn't end your career." Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into reshaping the culture she'd helped create. She instituted the education program, established an anonymous ethics hotline, restructured the performance review process to include peer feedback and upward evaluation. She started having lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of her office, asking people about their lives, learning their names, discovering that the company she'd built from spreadsheets and strategic plans was actually made of human beings with complicated stories and private struggles. And she kept an eye on Garrett, though not through security cameras this time. She learned that he'd enrolled in 3 online courses through the new education program: business ethics, financial management, and basic programming. She heard from his supervisor that Garrett had been offered a day shift position, but had turned it down because it would conflict with Grace's school schedule. She saw him in passing sometimes, pushing his cart through empty hallways, and they'd exchange brief nods of recognition, the kind of acknowledgement that exists between people who've seen each other at their worst and chosen grace over judgment. 3 months after that night in the archives room, Eleanor's assistant buzzed her office. "Ms. Hastings, there's a Garrett Sullivan here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. "Send him in." Garrett looked different in daylight, less shadowy and uncertain. He carried a manila envelope, which he set on her desk with careful deliberation. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this to you," he said without preamble. "I've been debating for weeks, but I keep thinking about what you said, about making things right, about the kind of company you want this to be." Eleanor opened the envelope and found a USB drive along with several pages of printed emails. She plugged the drive into her computer, and as she read, her blood went cold. The files contained evidence of exactly what Rebecca had suspected 3 years ago: budget irregularities, hidden transfers, a sophisticated scheme to skim money from vendor contracts. The emails showed Douglas Mercer coordinating the whole thing, along with 2 people in accounting who'd helped cover his tracks. "Where did you get this?" Eleanor asked. Garrett's expression was complicated. "When you fired Mercer, he cleaned out his office in a hurry, missed his personal laptop, left it in a drawer. Building services was told to box up anything remaining and send it to storage. I found the laptop, and He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "I knew I should turn it in immediately, but I kept thinking about Rebecca, about how everyone said she was wrong, how she died believing she'd failed. So I looked, and I found all of this." Eleanor studied the evidence, her mind already racing through implications and next steps. Garrett, this is huge. This could bring criminal charges. This could have brought the company down if it had continued unchecked." She looked up at him. Rebecca was right. She was right the whole time. "I know." Garrett's voice was rough. "I've been carrying that knowledge for 3 weeks, trying to figure out what to do with it. Part of me wanted to go to the press, to make sure everyone knew she'd been telling the truth, to vindicate her publicly." He paused. "But then I thought about what that would do to this company, to all the people who work here and depend on their jobs. I thought about the education program you started, about the changes you're making, about how you're trying to build something better. And I realized that burning it all down wouldn't honor Rebecca's memory. She didn't expose the corruption because she wanted to destroy the company. She did it because she wanted to fix it." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't known she was carrying. "You're giving me a choice." "I'm trusting you to do the right thing," Garrett corrected. "Whatever that is. You're the CEO. You're the one who has to decide if this company is worth saving, and what saving it actually means." After Garrett left, Eleanor sat alone with the evidence of her company's corruption, with proof that her instinct to delegate and trust had allowed something rotten to grow in the foundation. She could bury it, destroy the files, pretend she'd never seen them. Mercer was already gone, and the 2 accounting employees could be quietly let go without anyone being the wiser. Or she could do what Rebecca Sullivan had tried to do, bring it into the light, accept the consequences, and trust that transparency was stronger than reputation. Eleanor picked up her phone and called her lawyer. "I need you to come to the office immediately and bring someone who specializes in corporate fraud and self-reporting to authorities. I have something that needs to be properly disclosed." The next 6 months were brutal. The investigation made headlines, tanked the stock price temporarily, brought scrutiny from regulators and reporters, and angry board members who wanted to know how Eleanor could have let this happen on her watch. She spent countless hours in depositions and strategy meetings, explaining what she'd known and when she'd known it, defending her decision to come forward voluntarily instead of trying to contain the damage. The company survived, but barely, and Eleanor's reputation took a hit that would take years to rebuild. But through it all, she held on to something that felt more valuable than her previous certainty, a sense that she was finally running a company worth believing in. She established a memorial fund in Rebecca Sullivan's name, providing grants for women in STEM fields who'd experienced workplace retaliation. She made sure Rebecca's termination was officially reversed, her personnel file cleared of the false performance issues that had destroyed her career. And she reached out to Grace Sullivan's school, setting up a scholarship that would cover her education through college. A small gesture that could never compensate for a lost mother, but might help build the future Rebecca had wanted for her daughter. On a cold evening in late autumn, almost a year after that night in the archives room, Eleanor found herself back on the 15th floor. She'd made a habit of walking through the building at odd hours, no longer watching through cameras, but actually present, actually visible, actually available. The archives room had been cleaned out, the old filing cabinets donated or destroyed, the space converted into a study area for employees using the education program. Through the glass wall, she could see Garrett sitting at one of the new desks, his textbooks spread around him, his laptop open to a video lecture on management theory. Eleanor tapped on the glass, and he looked up, surprised. She gestured for him to join her in the hallway. When he emerged, she handed him an envelope. "Open it." Inside was an offer letter, junior position in the operations department, day shift, salary that was 3 times what he made as a janitor, benefits that included tuition reimbursement for his continuing education. Garrett stared at the paper, his hands shaking slightly. I haven't even finished my associate's degree yet. I'm not qualified for this." "You're more qualified than half the people I've hired with MBAs," Eleanor said firmly. "You understand what it means to work hard, to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself, to do the right thing even when it costs you. That's not something I can teach. The rest, the technical skills, the business knowledge, that's just training. You're already doing the work to get there." She paused. "And Grace deserves to see her father succeed. She deserves to know that her mother's integrity meant something, that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it fails in the moment, that matters. You can show her that by accepting this job and building the career you've been working toward." Garrett's eyes were bright again, but this time he didn't bother hiding the tears. "Rebecca would have liked you," he said quietly. I think if she could see what you've done, how you've changed things, she would feel like it was worth it, like her fight meant something." Eleanor felt her own eyes sting. "I hope so. I'm trying to build the kind of company she believed this could be. The kind of place where people like her don't get crushed for telling the truth." She held out her hand. "So what do you say? Want to help me finish what your wife started?" Garrett took her hand, his grip firm and certain. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I really do." As Eleanor walked back to the elevator, she passed by the new memorial plaque that had been installed in the main lobby. It listed employees who'd made significant contributions to the company's ethical culture, and Rebecca Sullivan's name was first. The plaque included a quote that Garrett had chosen from Rebecca's journals. "Integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to acknowledge imperfection and do better." Eleanor stood in front of the plaque for a long moment, thinking about the year that had passed, about everything that had changed and everything she'd learned. She'd started out watching Garrett through security cameras, certain she was protecting her company from a threat, convinced that her suspicion was the same as wisdom. Instead, she'd discovered that the real threat had been her own distance, her own willingness to trust systems over people, to value efficiency over humanity, to run a company without really seeing the human beings who made it function. The building was quieter now, the aggressive growth targets replaced with sustainable goals, the fear-based management replaced with something that resembled actual trust. The company was smaller than it had been, more focused, more careful. But it was also more honest, more decent, more like something worth building a life around. Eleanor's wealth had taken a hit. Her power had diminished. Her reputation had been complicated by scandal and recovery. But when she looked at herself in the mirrored elevator walls now, she saw someone she recognized, someone she could maybe even admire. Not the CEO who'd built an empire, the person who'd torn it down to something more human and tried to rebuild it with grace. The elevator doors opened on the 30th floor, and Eleanor stepped out into her corner office with its view of the city lights. She still worked too much, still struggled with loneliness, still wondered sometimes if she'd given up too much in pursuit of success. But she also knew that the man who used to clean her office was now studying in the converted archives room, that his daughter would grow up knowing her mother had been right, that somewhere in the complicated machinery of capitalism and ambition, there was still room for decency and second chances and the slow, difficult work of trying to be better than you were. Eleanor sat down at her desk and pulled up the security monitors, not to spy, but to check that the building was safe, that everyone who remained had gone home to the lives they built outside these walls. The screens cycled through empty hallways and dark offices, through the cafeteria and the mailroom and the converted archives room, where a single desk lamp still glowed. Garrett was still there, still studying, still reaching toward a future he was building one textbook at a time. Eleanor smiled, closed the monitors, and turned off her own light. Some things didn't need to be watched. Some things just needed to be trusted to become what they were meant to be. She left her office and took the stairs down, all 30 floors, feeling the burn in her legs and the steady rhythm of descent. When she reached the ground floor, she paused at the memorial plaque one more time. "Thank you, Rebecca," she said softly to the engraved name, "for being stubborn enough to tell the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it, for teaching me that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing, for reminding me that people matter more than profits, always." Outside, the city was alive with its usual chaos, traffic and voices, and the beautiful mess of millions of people trying to make their way through another day. Eleanor walked to her car, but before getting in, she looked back up at the building she'd spent her adult life constructing. The lights from the 30th floor still glowed, a beacon visible for blocks. But the light she found herself watching was the one on 15, steady and small, and somehow more meaningful than all the altitude and grandeur she'd accumulated. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, new problems to solve, new ways the company could fail or succeed. But tonight, Eleanor had this, the knowledge that she'd looked at her own worst suspicions, found them wanting, and chosen to build something better in their place. She'd watched a janitor through security cameras and discovered he was actually teaching her how to see. And in the end, the shocking truth wasn't about betrayal or corruption or corporate espionage. It was simpler and more profound than that. The truth was that everyone carried invisible weights, fought invisible battles, and deserved to be seen with compassion rather than suspicion. The truth was that power without humanity was just another kind of poverty, and success without integrity was just another kind of failure. The truth was that sometimes the person you think is stealing from you is actually trying to give you back something you'd lost without knowing it, like the ability to trust, to hope, to believe that broken things could be repaired and that second chances could lead to something more beautiful than what came before. Eleanor got in her car and drove home through streets that suddenly felt less lonely, carrying with her the weight of everything she'd learned and everything she still had left to become.